And we are off. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Director ID webinar. My name is Warren, and I'm the head of CAS 360 here at BGL, and I'll be taking you through the webinar today. Hopefully, you can see my screen as I'll get that started, and hopefully you can hear me all loud and clear. Now, joining me today from BGL to handle your questions are Jeremy and Andy from the CAS 360 team. So if you do have any questions throughout the content today, please ask away in the Q&A section of your Zoom, and we will do our best to answer every question that comes through. Also, before we start, the session is recorded. Okay, so the session is recorded. We will be packaging this up into a nice video so that you can all watch the replay a little bit later, as we've already got questions coming through. So here we go. What I'll do is I'll get through the content. We'll obviously try our best to answer all the questions as they come through, but please, all your questions in the Q&A and we will go from there. So what are we going to be covering off today? Well, first of all, we'll cover off Director ID. So I'm going to start from the absolute beginning and go through some of the very basics of Director ID, but then quickly speed that up and talk about Director ID and the future. And I'll also talk about the CAS 360 features that we have built directly for, or completely for Director ID. We released some of these features almost 12 months to the day ago. We released an update just before the 31st of October 2021 with a lot of these features to help you with Director ID. I hope none of them are new to you, but I will take you through some of the Director ID features in CAS 360 so that if you have been a little slow to get started with Director ID, there's still enough time to get the ball rolling. So, for Director ID, what I'm going to cover is who, what, so who needs to get it, what it is, what the obligations are, give you an update on the current numbers for Director ID, and talk a little bit about enforcement, okay? Because enforcement is an important part of the Director ID process. Okay, so this is sort of an overview of Director ID. So in we go with the basics. Director ID started, the whole regime started on the 1st of November 2021. That's when the very first rules came in. Now, there were sort of 3 sets of transitional rules that took place up until really up until April. And then sort of the main rules came in where there are some really clear requirements around who needs to get a Director ID. Now, what is a Director ID? It is a unique identifier that company directors will keep forever. So it's a unique number, okay? Think of it as a tax file number and another number from the government. It's not as secretive as the tax file number is, but it is another unique number to identify company directors. All directors, this is the really important part, all directors are required by law to verify their identity with the ABRS before receiving a Director ID. It is an identification mechanism. For many of you that have been doing company secretary work or have been a company director for a long time, you may know that the requirements to become a director are very simple. You need to provide a name, an address, a date of birth, and a place of birth. They're supposed to be real information, but there's not a lot of validation around that data. If you've got data in the name field that looks like a name and you've got an address that looks like an address and a date of birth that looks like a date of birth, it will get accepted, right? So there isn't any verification behind that data. So this is what the Director ID is. It is complete verification of the person's identity. So who needs a Director ID? You need a Director ID if you are an eligible officer of a company, a registrable body, or a registered foreign company under the Corporations Act. So it does apply to foreign companies, Australian registered foreign companies. Okay, so just the clarification there, Australian registered foreign companies. Obviously, the main cohort here is the Australian registered Australian companies, which is where we have, over 2 million registered Australian companies. So all of those company directors are required. It does also apply under the CATSI Act or the CATSI legislation as well for those companies that are registered under that legislation. An eligible officer is a person who is appointed as a director or an alternate director who is acting in that capacity. So secretaries are exempt. They're not part of the legislation. Okay, so it is directors and alternate directors only. What is also really important is if you are an Australian company director living overseas, you are still required to get a director ID. So even if you are not living in Australia, right, you are not an Australian citizen, if you are a director of an Australian company, the legislation applies to you. So I know that many of you will deal with companies that have foreign directors. If the company is an Australian registered company, so it's on the ASIC register, then those directors, this law applies to them. Okay, so I can't be any clearer. The foreign directors are included in the director ID process. So I talked a little bit about the different application dates and things like that. So again, I'll go through and try and make this really clear. If you were a director on or before the 31st of October 2021, your deadline to complete the director ID is the 30th of November 2022. So this is why it is the final countdown. As you can tell, we have just over 30 days until that requirement comes live. And essentially directors that haven't got their director ID by that 30th of November are in breach of their obligations. Now, if the director was appointed, and this is the part of the transitional measure, if the director was appointed from the 1st of November 2021 to the 4th of April 2022, so that little gap there, they had 28 days to apply for the director ID. Obviously, that has passed. There's no more of those exemptions, and anyone from the 5th of April, any director appointed from the 5th of April 2022 must have a director ID before appointment. And this goes, and I do talk a little bit about this towards the back end of the webinar, around the firm's practices of collating director information. Essentially, from the 5th of April 2022, you should have put a rule in for your practice not to appoint any directors without a director ID. If you did do that, it would have made this process a lot easier so far. However, if you haven't done that, I strongly recommend that any director being appointed, just like you get the director's name and address and date of birth and place of birth, you add an extra requirement for them to provide their director ID before you go through the process of adding them to a company. In regards to the CATSI Act directors, they actually do have a little bit of an extended period. Obviously, there's a smaller number of companies in that group, but they do have an extended period. So their deadline is the 30th of November 2023. So this is when. Now, there is a lot of questions about this and a lot of clarification that people are after. So there are two things I'm going to clarify here. If you were a director or on or before the 31st of October, you have until the 30th of November 2022. That's to apply. That's still the case if you become a director of another company after the 31st of October 2021. So again, this is part of the transition. If you were an existing director on the 31st of October 2021, you actually had the full year. Okay, it was only the new first-time directors that had that from April 5th requirement to get their director ID. Anyone that was an existing director was part of that, I suppose, transitional process. So that's clarification one. Clarification two is the next one, and this is the important part. You need a director ID even if you have ceased your position. Okay, I'm just shielding myself from the comments right now. But if you were a director on the 31st of October 2021, the rule from the ABRS is that you need your director ID even if you have since resigned. If you were a director on that 1st of November 2021, you need a director ID. You are required to identify yourself. Okay, so you form part of that requirement. There is no, in the legislation right now, there is no exemption or guidance at all for directors that have subsequently resigned. Okay, if you were a director on the 31st of October 2021, that's when the legislation started, or the 1st of November 2021, that's when the legislation started. That's when it became an obligation for directors. If the director has since resigned, the obligation remains. It is not something that they were exempt from the obligation. Okay, so that's how the legislation is and how it's being interpreted by the ABRS right now as of today. Again, I can see the Q&A ticking up. It's like a counter going up. They're flying up. All right. I hope the guys are okay. We'll get to the questions. Okay, and the deadline is the 30th of November, 2022. Okay, so the deadline is fast approaching. Okay, so how do you get your director ID? Right? Now, I tried to be a little bit creative here. It's not through MyGov, it's through MyGovID. So putting up a meme, maybe this is the way to educate people these days, but if you like this, you can use it. I created it, but it is through MyGovID that you need to go through, or your clients need to go through to get their director ID. So let's go through how you get your director ID. So the best way to do it is online via MyGovID. Okay, this is the preferred and it is the easiest option. All you're required to do is have ID documents and TFN/tax information handy. So MyGovID is important. It's the easiest way to go. I'll talk. There's a next slide that talks a bit about setting things up via MyGovID and how your clients can go through that process. But certainly through MyGovID is the main and preferred way. There are, of course, other methods. There's two other methods. There is a phone method. Okay, so I'll talk about it next, but MyGovID requires you to have a smartphone. Not many. Just about everyone has a smartphone, but not everyone. So there is a standard phone way to go through. There is also a paper form, okay? And then the paper form is linked there. You certainly can go through the paper form method. In terms of what's preferred from the ABRS, obviously the ABRS would prefer you go through MyGovID, would prefer, if you can't go through MyGovID, if you're an Australian resident, to go through phone. And if you are obviously a non-Australian resident, you can use the paper form, okay? So MyGovID, and how does MyGovID work? Because this MyGovID for accountants is actually quite well known. Maybe not so well known for some of the businesses and some of your clients. So MyGovID is obviously done online. And with MyGovID, the requirements are, first of all, to have a smartphone, okay? Because you need to download the MyGovID app. That is essentially an authentication. So in the App Store, there is a MyGovID app, and you download that. From there, you obviously need, the next layer is a unique email address. Again, this becomes a little bit of an issue, especially if you've got clients that, that are like husband and wife and things like that, that share the same email address. There needs to be a unique email address per person. Okay, so that's an important thing here. And obviously you can't go through the MyGovID requirements if you are under 15, but you also can't be a director if you're under 18. So there should be no issues with that rule. And then it goes into your identification and the documents you'll need. So once you have downloaded the MyGovID app and you've logged in through your unique email address, if you've never done this before, then you have to go through and identify yourself. So obviously the standard identification documents are required there. I know that there's people that have got sort of, identification documents that might have different names and things like that. That might require another step to go through, and that is potentially where MyGov does get involved. But having different names can create some issues for your clients. And certainly the names that are being used for the MyGovID need to sort of match the identity documents. Otherwise, there's going to be some issues along the way. And if you do have those sorts of issues, it might be best to go through the phone method. Certainly that's a method I had to go through. So certainly, yeah, it might be best if you have those sort of name conflicts to go through the phone method, because the MyGovID app might not work. But for the documents required, obviously driver's license, passport, birth certificate, visa, things like that, they will identify you. Okay, so that's the first step, is to complete identity verification, or your client's identity verification. And then the second layer there is then completing or connecting that identification to a tax instrument like a TFN or something to do with your super fund and things like that. Effectively, what we are doing here is identifying yourself and then linking that identification to a record within the ATO, right? So that's essentially what's happening. So they are now connected. Your identification and your tax record is connected, okay? And then a Director ID is issued. So hopefully that helps explain it. And if you are getting calls from your clients and things like that, this will help explain exactly what is required. Certainly, if you're having issues explaining this process, it might be best to refer your customers to the phone method, because at least there they get to talk to a person. And I know that the ABRS have increased the number of support staff that they have available. So yeah, if your clients are having issues going through the smartphone method, then it might be easier for them to use the phone. However, personally, I use the MyGovID for my Director ID. It was very quick. So it did work, and it has worked, nearly 1 million times now. Moving on to obligations. And there's a lot of questions. I'll try and answer some of those questions towards the end for those that aren't being answered by Andy and Jeremy. Excuse me. All company directors are required to apply for a Director ID within the relevant timeframe. And that is before November 30, 2022. So in the next 30 days or so. That is what they are required to do. Obviously, they're beyond that. They are required to apply for a Director ID when they are being directed to by the registrar. They are not allowed to apply for more than one Director ID. You only identify yourself once. You are not allowed to misrepresent your Director ID to any government body. No breach to the above or to the Director ID guidelines. And if you cannot apply for a Director ID in time, apply for an extension. I'd say applying for an extension is almost harder than applying for the ID itself, but there is an extension available. So what about privacy, and what about your obligations as an agent for looking after those Director IDs that come in? So all company Director IDs are considered private information, but they are not to the same level as a TFM. The ABRS are not allowed to issue Director ID numbers to anyone other than the director themselves. A big part of the Director ID legislation is focused on the director identifying themselves. This is why we as agents and software providers are not allowed to do it for the directors. The directors must do it themselves. And the ABRS aren't allowed to issue the number to anyone but the applying director. However, the director is free to provide this information to anyone, and agents are allowed to store this information in their systems, and software applications are able to share Director IDs via APIs. So this is all allowed. Director IDs are not treated with the same rules or by the same rules as TFNs. Okay, so there is some, I suppose, a little bit of exemptions or cutouts there. The ABRS are restricted by the transitional legislation. So once Director ID process has been completed, the understanding is that Director IDs will become public. Now that won't happen the 1st of December 2023. It will probably happen as part of the new company register. But the understanding around Director IDs, or part of the initial reasoning for Director IDs, was actually to have the ID, the Director ID public, the number public, and then sort of more private information like date of birth and address information, which currently sits as public information on the public register. The idea was for that sort of information to become non-public and the ID number to be used around that director. So instead of seeing Warren Rendon on the register with my address and date of birth and place of birth, you would see something like Warren Rendon, my Director ID, and then maybe the suburb that I live in. Okay, so that's sort of more longer term, and a part of why Director ID is in action. The other part obviously being clearly identifying who the people are that run the companies. So let's go through the numbers that we are currently seeing for Director ID. So right now there are 800,000 plus, so a few more obviously over the last couple of weeks, but 800,000 or so Director IDs have been issued. Okay, so the system works, the ID process works. There's a lot of people that have gone through the process. Okay, generally about 90% of those are existing directors and around 10% of those are being directors needing to complete their requirements within the 28 days or immediately post-April. In terms of total known directors, there's around 2.5 million total directors. So around 32% have completed their director ID obligations. So certainly not everyone, and certainly there is an expectation that there'll be a late rush as the deadline fast approaches, and I guess the ABRS are doing a little bit more public promoting of director ID and things like that, but there's a lot to go still. So 67, 68% still to go. So let's talk a little bit about enforcement and how enforcement is being done. So the ABRS gave essentially the first 5 months for free, right? There was no enforcement whatsoever on director ID from when it commenced on the 1st of November to up through till March this year. And then the enforcement started. So the focus was obviously on first-time directors who had not completed their director ID requirements. Obviously, these are the ones that fell into that 28 days or post-April, the before appointment requirement. And this is where the ABRS was spending all of their enforcement resources. Letters were obviously being sent out to directors who do not have director IDs. Letters were also being sent to tax agents and registered agents, and maybe some made their way to you. There were no fines issued, and still, to my knowledge at this stage at least, there hasn't been any fines issued. However, fines can be issued under the legislation. Okay, so at the moment, the enforcement had been, I guess, a little bit more soft in that it was the ABRS were sending letters, sending notifications out to directors that they needed to apply. Okay, so that's where the enforcement has been. In terms of continuing that enforcement, the ABRS is contacting directors to make them aware of their obligation and encouraging applications. Initially, the ABRS will focus on education and awareness and helping directors to do the right thing. So it is very much a sort of a coaching as opposed to the penalty coming in yet. The registrar may take a firmer compliance actions and can issue directors with a direction to apply for director ID. Directors who do not meet their obligations after being contacted or referred, but may be referred to ASIC, who are responsible for enforcing director ID offences, which obviously can be criminal penalties. And obviously the penalties and the information about the penalties are linked in the slides here. However, I do have the penalties here. So the penalties are not small. In fact, the penalties will actually go up because they're linked to the Commonwealth penalty points, which if some of you read that deeply into the budget, they got a significant increase in the penalty points. So these amounts will actually go up, but $13,000 is a lot of money. It's a lot more than a couple of late annual review fees, as you can see there. So significant penalties, but to this stage, there hasn't been any enforcement of those penalties. In terms of what's coming next, we don't have too much information around what is going to be happening post November 30, 2022. And I know that this is a bit of obviously a controversial area because of the resigned directors and things like that. My view is that enforcement will certainly step up post November 30 on existing directors. And they'll be sort of chasing up and following up those existing directors that have not completed their director ID obligations. I know that there is a group of resigned directors that obviously that still have the obligation as well. However, logic sort of says that they'll go after the existing directors first, I think. Certainly, they're a little bit more pressing those existing directors. If a director has ceased while they are part of the legislation, they might not represent too much of the risk. So in terms of director and director ID, tax agent and registered agent information, you may have seen this email. Okay, so you may have seen this or some of the letters that were sent out. Certainly in things like the ASIC in Focus newsletter and a lot of the ATO and ABRS newsletters, there's been some important things sent out around the Director ID obligations, Director ID timelines, and things like that. So here is an example of one of those. I've talked a little bit about this, but we've tried to, I suppose, implement some key things in CAS 360 that will help you meet these obligations. And I'll talk a little bit about the features in a moment. But you can't appoint right now. You cannot appoint a director for the first time without a Director ID. In CAS 360, you may have seen this. When you go to make that appointment, CAS 360 will ask you to put the details of that particular person in, and there'll be a big bar that says no Director ID has been input. Okay, so there is that requirement there for you to get that Director ID. And it does mean that there's more work for agents and more requirements on agents to collect that information. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, I would certainly include Director ID now as as part of the mandatory information that a director must apply for you to complete that appointment. To the extent, I don't want to tell you how to do your jobs, but certainly if someone was coming to me for a appointment of a director and they were refusing to get a Director ID, I wouldn't be doing the appointment. I think that I'd be making them get their Director ID before completing that appointment. So what do you need to know for the next 30 days? Well, every company director must have their Director ID by November 2022. Okay, that's what you need to know. It is as simple as that. There are a huge amount of directors that have 30 days to get this Director ID. You can manage this in CAS 360. That's the next thing I want you all to know. We've built tools. The tools have been there for a year. They're proven, they're tested. We've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Director IDs in CAS 360. You can manage this all through the alerts in CAS 360. You can send initial emails. You can send reminder emails, all to your directors to get them to start completing this application. You're able to cross-check this information and the information you have with our Director ID report. And you can use the annual review process to promote Director ID. Inside, and you'll see with part of the workflow that we've built, but inside the annual review pack is a Director ID letter, and we've had that in there for over 6 months now. By 30th of November 2022, every company director must apply for a Director ID. This is the end of the transitional period, and it will be an offence to not have applied for a Director ID post this date for existing directors, obviously. So really important that these directors, that your clients, this information is getting out to them. The seriousness of their obligation and the importance of their obligation is getting out to them. And we've built some tools to help you do that. The last thing that I want you to know before we get into the CAS 360 sort of demonstration is that there will be no changes to ASIC forms, okay, or services like the form 201, 484, 490. None of that information will include the Director ID. There are no new fields in those forms for Director IDs, okay? And the Director ID numbers will not appear on annual reviews or ASIC data downloads, okay? So you won't see any changes to those. And the Director ID is not required to be provided to ASIC unless they're essentially chasing you. There's no lodgement requirement to provide that information to ASIC. So what I'm going to do now is take you through some of the Director ID features in CAS 360. I see there's only a tiny number, 45, 46 unanswered questions in the Q&A. I will touch on them at the end, but I'll go through these features and then I'll get over to the questions. So here we go. We'll move you over now to CAS 360 and hopefully you can see that all up on your screen. And hopefully it's nice and big enough for you all to see that. If it's not, let me know. What I'm going to do, I will just make it slightly bigger for you. What I'm going to do is show you, first of all, the Director ID alert and how it works. Now, as I said, we launched this feature a year ago. So it's been there and it's been doing this work for a lot of firms. If you haven't been using it, welcome, hello. Hopefully you get some value out of it. So here we go, Director ID alert. And what this will do, as soon as I click on this on the left-hand side here, it will filter the screen and show me all of the companies that require Director ID. So if I had foreign or non-Australian companies, sorry, wrong word, non-Australian companies in my database or things like that, they wouldn't be included, they'd be filtered out. And then we'll fall into the required by November 2022 deadline here, okay? And then I've also got my overdue ones, and these are the newly appointed directors that potentially don't have director IDs. And then I've got my green filter here, which is the complete ones. The required by 28 days is now obsolete. So on every single Australian company, we've got the director ID alert, and I've filtered those. So let's now have a look at the alert, and the company I'm going to have a look at here is Bean Roasters. So my first company here, I can put my mouse over this and I've got information regarding director ID. Bean Roasters has 3 directors that do not have director ID. So I click on go to director IDs, and up will come my director ID screen. So here I have a whole heap of features. First of all, I have a list of my directors. I can see the directors in that company. I can also see their email address. Now, if I haven't got an email address, I can add it into this screen. Okay, so I've got my directors, I've got their email address. I can put my mouse over the I here so I can see a little bit more information relating to that director should I need to. Okay, and I can also see the other companies that they are a director of. So I can see Warren here is a director of 11 other companies. Right. So I've got a lot of information here, and I've also got the due date for their director ID. Okay, so I can see the due date for when they need their director ID. So got a fair bit of information here. Now, if you haven't notified, you haven't sent the initial email for that company, you've got a big blue box at the top, and it says email all directors without director ID in email all directors in Bean Roasters. So what I'm going to do is click on send now. Now CAS 360 is smart enough to identify that Warren has already added his director ID into CAS 360, so we don't need to send the email for Warren. It will only send it to the 3 contacts. So I click on send now, and up will come my introduction to director ID email template. Now this is an email template that we have created. You've got full control over it and you can customize it. But what we are doing here is we are sending off an email notifying those directors about their director ID requirements. So that is an email that we have written and will be sent off to your clients. Okay, now you have to do that per company, right? That's how we've built it, so that you can go through one by one and hit those emails. But if you've got the email addresses in there, it can be done very quickly. The reason we did it per company is because you need to have the email addresses. We can't send emails without email addresses. So what we're able to do is check the email addresses and make sure you've got them in there. We can also make sure that, that you're sending it to the right contacts, and we will identify where that particular director has already received an email. So if you have a director who's involved in 5 companies, for example, they actually receive an email with their 5 companies, but they only receive 1. They don't ever receive more than 1 email, okay? So we've built some smarts in it around that as well. Now, that's the initial email. Once you've sent the email out, I'll go back into that screen. Once you've sent that email out, just like I've got here for Mary, it will tell me that the email has been sent, okay? And I can, instead of sending the all directors email, I can just send reminders to individual directors. Okay, so send that off, that email off. Again, the reminder email is slightly different because it's a reminder. Okay, it's not, and obviously here we list the companies that they are a director of. And again, it directs them to go through that process. Okay, so it is a customizable email again that you can send off to those directors. So we've built in CAS 360 first of all, the alert to identify the companies and the directors. We've built the director ID screen and the director ID workflow where you can send the initial email, and you can also then send the follow-up email. What we've also added is the ability for you to put the director ID into CAS 360. The emails that we have written refer to this and essentially ask your customers to reply to the email and send the director ID through to you so that you can keep track of it. And when the client replies, all you need to do is click on Add Director ID, and you can paste that Director ID into the screen here. And that will allow you to store and record the Director ID for that particular contact. Okay. You can also go into the contact screen and add the Director ID in there. When you do add the director ID, we have an algorithm there that will verify that it is at least a director ID that matches the algorithm. We don't have any intelligence to match up if it's that particular person's ID, but we are similar to like an ACN. We are able to tell you that it is a valid director ID number. So that's the alerts and the workflow and the initial email and the reminder emails, but we've got so much more. In reports, we have a director ID report here that has again been here for the best part of 12 months, where you can extract a list of all your company directors and if they've got a director ID or not. So you've got an Excel version. We know you're accountants, you love Excel, and we've given you a very big Excel spreadsheet there. The next feature is all about your annual review. So in your annual review workflow, again, a lot of you will have seen this. In your annual review workflow, you have the director ID alert. And when you are processing your annual review, you can send your director ID reminders. So I can see Andy hasn't got his director ID here. So I can quickly send him a reminder, right? So I'm able to remind him about his director ID obligations from within the annual review screen. And then when I prepare my annual review pack, I've also got the ABRS director ID letter that I can include as well. So this is the official ABRS director ID letter. Okay, so again, this has been in the software for a long time now, and certainly hope that you are including this in your messages out. What we have also added, and we've done this, we've had this in the system for a while now, is around your new contact creation. So if I was to go to my company screen here and go and add a new officer, right? So when I go and add a new person, what I'm able to do is when I click on to create that new person, I've got the ability to put in their director ID. So alongside all of their information, I can add their director ID. And if I was to select a person, straight away, CAS 360 will tell me if the director ID information has been added or not, and I can add that in if I need to, okay? That is all there as well. That workflow is also in the company incorporation process as well. Okay, so you have that available to you as well in the company registration process. So that whole director ID quick add and also the director ID verification and checking. So that is an overview of the CAS 360 director ID features. I'll go back to the slides. And I'll talk a little bit about what is next with director ID, and then I'll get into the questions. So what's the next phase for director ID? Well, the first one was, it was September 2023. It was going to be. We now don't have an ETA. The ETA is to be confirmed. But effectively, September 2023 was when the director ID information was going to connect to the new company's register. Okay. However, the new company's register has been delayed. The ABRS plans to automatically link some of the director ID numbers to directors. Okay, that is their plan and that is what they are going to do. And the rest will need to be linked either by agents or the directors themselves. Okay, so we'll see how that works out. Hopefully the ABRS are able to do a lot of the linking automatically as opposed to us and agents. And effectively, this is why the directors are to provide you with their director ID, because it is essential, because there may be a process down the track where the linking will need to be done. All right, any questions? I'll leave you with a comment we had on our socials from Lynn, who gave us a nice thank you, and that they've got 95% of their directors with director IDs, which is fantastic. And I hope that all of you are in the same category. Only a few questions, only 40 to go. So here we go. Let me just have some water and I'll go through these questions and answer them the best I can. Is there a way to send a mass prompt to all outstanding directors to obtain director ID? Look, not via CAS 360, Tiffany. Okay, so in CAS 360, we have made the emails per company, because we want you to actually do some checking on that company, make sure you've got the email address, make sure you're verifying the details before sending the email. I know it does take a little bit longer, but it will mean that the quality is being sent out is better. As an obligation, should we as registered agents not appoint directors unless they have the number? Look, I have said that, and I certainly think that that's a good practice to get into, Tiffany, so yes. I already had my MyGovID account for tax portal access. How can I apply for the Director ID using my existing MyGovID? Mary, again, you should be able to do this pretty simply. Certainly, this is the process I went through because I already had a MyGovID. So on the ABRS website, click on Director ID and try to go through that process through there. It was very simple. Once I had already had a MyGovID, all I needed to do was log in and provide my TFN, and they gave me the Director ID straight away. Where are the ABRS advertising? I think airports and things like that, hopefully radio and TV. It should come out soon. Is there any information we can provide to clients from the ABRS of ceased director requirements? It's not clearly outlined on the website. It is a big issue, Melissa. Certainly the information we are being told is that there is no exemption in the legislation as it currently stands. Hopefully there is some wording on the ABRS website soon. Unfortunately, we can't control that. ASIC contacting everyone direct who requires a director ID. It would be possible for someone to have resigned from a company post October 2021 and may no longer be attached to an agent. Yeah, so generally speaking, ASIC are charged with the enforcement of the, I suppose, the penalties and the process of director ID. So effectively, they would be reaching out to those directors that are required to get a director ID. Okay. I don't know too much other than what they've been doing to those newly appointed directors, where they have been sort of chasing them up and reaching out to them with letters. So yeah, that's the best I know at the moment. Will CAS 360 be updated to send bulk email to all directors and all companies at the same time? Anthony, no, not at this stage. Will penalties be applied to those foreign directors who had to get their director ID application processed manually? I think, Ashley, I think the fines and penalties, without going too far into, I think the fines and penalties will be much more targeted at people that are resisting rather than those that are trying to do the right thing and may have lapsed by a few days. I don't think there's going to be a whole heap of fines sent out on the 1st of November, put it that way, 1st of December, sorry. Can we send emails in one go without having to send them to each director? Like I know there are so many directors that still need to get their director ID that there are actually limits on the system as well. We can't send 2 million emails out immediately. It would break the system. If a company was voluntarily deregistered during the year, the director have an obligation to apply. Deborah, at this stage, yes, the obligation is to apply even if they have ceased being a director. If they're effectively a director on the 1st of November 2021, then the obligation applies to them. Can you do a multiple client advice to persons still needing to get their director ID? I have answered that question. Will the director need to contact the ABRS directly to update their address change? Great question. At this stage, for directors that are changing their address, it is all and only done through ASIC. It is not done through the ABRS. So there is no obligation for directors to notify of change of details to the ABRS. They need to verify their identity, and that is all that the requirement is at this stage. In relation to information of director on the ASIC database and their application information is different, should we be lodging a form 492 to correct the ASIC database? Look, I think it's always best practice to have the correct information. So if the information is incorrect, then it would be best to correct it. However, a big part of this whole new companies register is going to be linking the director information with the director ID. and utilising that information as the source of identification. My long-winded answer is getting to the answer of you might not have to. So if the difference is big and it's clearly wrong, I think Lodger 492, if we're talking about a letter or something like that, you might get away with waiting. There's a question here. May I ask what is the time frame? I'm not quite sure what that refers to. Christine, if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more, and I might be able to answer. Will SMS become available as a Director ID reminder? Look, not at this stage, Joe. Not at this stage. The yellow icon does not cover directors who have resigned. That is correct. It does not cover directors that have resigned because it is only a very recent clarification. We'll see what we can do about that. Is it possible to just send reminders for the Director ID alert? Yes, Alice, you're able to send reminders directly from the Director ID alert. Do you know how individuals were told about this regime? Yeah, by their registered agents. There wasn't much communication publicly. Yeah, it goes to the point that one of the biggest failings, I'd say, is that there just hasn't been enough public notification about this requirement. So yeah, it's a big issue because there was no budget. It wasn't as if there was mass TV advertising 12 months ago or mass letters sent out 12 months ago. It wasn't. Maybe when we look back and do a review, the information just wasn't processed or passed on to the right people. Will CAS 360 set up an alert to follow up Director IDs that have not responded? Look, at this stage, Anthony, we don't have plans to do that. So at this stage, we don't. Are you going to be putting filters on Director ID report, labels, partners, etc.? It's a good question, Leanne. I think, yeah, reach out to us and we might be able to help you out there. Once the Director ID is added to CAS, does this sync with the ABRS? The short answer is no, not at this stage. This is all part of that new register, which will happen 2023, 2024, 3052, 4021, whatever year. It will all happen eventually. Maybe we'll be in the industry, maybe we won't be. Question here. And don't want to make light of that question, but the long-term plan is for it to link, but I just don't know when that's going to happen. Can the Director ID report possibly be made as a complete report for contacts only, as there are duplicates due to numerous appointments? I understand, Tiffany, I understand that there are duplicates, but the duplicates are there for a reason, because we're trying to identify if you've got duplicates and include those, right? So I do understand. But yeah, we've tried to build it in a way that no one was missed. Can you send a reminder via CAS 360 to directors of deregistered companies? You probably have to trick the system, Matthew, at this stage. As I said, it's a very recent clarification. So we haven't had the time or opportunity to release something about it. We have an older group of clients as part of a charitable association. They wouldn't have NOAs or ATO docs. What would be the best way to get their Director ID? I mean, they would have to have, even if they're part of a charitable association, they would have to at some point have a tax file number or a superannuation fund and things like that. So it's the personal tax file number, not the company tax file number. But the best thing to do in those instances is to get them to complete their obligations over the phone to the ABRS as opposed to going through the app. Does the ABRS manual application for the Director ID have an original document to save on the slow postal service internationally? It's probably a better question for the ABRS, but I guess, as I've said before, if people are going through the process of applying, it's better than resisting an application. Where on the ABRS can I log in to provide TFN to register Director ID? So Mary, go through the ABRS website, go to Director ID and click on Apply for Director ID. And that will kick off your MyGovID login, which you'll need your phone for. You'll need to put in the code, and then it will log into your MyGovID. Click on Complete Director ID, put in your TFN, it will ask you for your TFN or something, and you put your TFN in and click Apply, and that's how you get the Director ID. I know that because that's exactly what I did. As I said, the ABRS and ASIC, this is a bit hard because they no longer meet the criteria on the form because they say that they have to be a director or becoming a director. As I said to the ABRS and ASIC, this is not the case. They don't meet the criteria to apply. And I was told, no, they don't. So they couldn't say if they had to or not to get one. Look, Sharon, I completely agree with you. I guess I'm presenting to you the advice I'm being given. It's not really my position to provide an opinion, certainly not in this forum. I've provided my opinion back to the ABRS, and let's just say it's in line with yours. However, yeah, I'm trying to get the message out there that at this stage, the definition of the legislation or how they're viewing it is that those ceased officers are required. Does this mean that you have to do the application by paper? You certainly can do the application online, by phone or by paper. So yeah, I did cover that a little bit earlier about those different examples, I guess, of when to use what method. So hopefully that answers the question. Will the email reminder sent through CAS 360 be using our practice email address or generated CAS email address? As this may be marked as spam. Certainly I understand, Tiffany. So there's two answers here, because in CAS 360 by default, you use the no reply CAS 360. However, if you go into settings, email settings, you can use your firm's email address. So you can use your firm's address if you wanted to. Certainly you can look into that. There is a one-off fee for that. But if you wanted to have a look at that, Tiffany, you could. It's just in settings, email settings. Next question, only 20 to go, we're getting there. I've also gone to check how many reminders I've sent to a director through the messages outbox and couldn't find. This is only by company. I'll have to get back to you on that because they should be there. But does this mean that they have to do the application by paper if the company has been deregistered? No, if the company has been deregistered, then if you're an Australian resident, certainly go through that process yourself through the MyGovID online process. If that can't be done, then if you are an Australian resident living in Australia, use the phone. If you are a foreign resident, use the paper form is the method to go through. Yep, I've answered that question. An exemption form rather than an extension form, please. I'd have to fill out 2.5 million of them, Joe. What is the covered date that a resigned director is still required for the Director ID? Effectively the 1st of November 2021. So if they were a director on the 1st of November 2021, the legislation applies to them. I've had a look at that and I can't see where to add. I'm not sure what that is in reference to. Can you update your contact search so the Director ID is visible in the results? We have got a few of these questions, Catherine. At this stage, we haven't put it in there, but it doesn't mean that we won't. As agent, if Director ID is not synced with ABRS and ASIC, how are fines issued? Look, Lisa, probably a bit of a long-winded story, but yeah, but essentially the ABRS and ASIC are sharing data between each other and cross-checking and making sure that, yeah, that the directors that are being appointed have Director IDs. And if they are not, they're sending letters out. They've got ways. So let me get this straight. If a company has already been deregistered anytime after the 1st of November and is now deregistered, totally the directors of the deregistered company still need a Director ID. Donovan, yes. What if the director's company will cease operation and ABN has been cancelled, does the director still need to apply, even if he will no longer a director of any company who was appointed before October 20? It's more a case of if the person was a director. Doesn't matter when they were appointed. If it was before, it's if they were appointed after, I guess. After the 1st of November, they were active or appointed after. As I said, a lot of this is based on current legislation. So this is so they do apply. Well, they do need to apply. Go. Directors who ceased prior to 31st of October 21 have not been appointed as a director since are exempt. Yes, that is correct. Before 31st of October 2021, they would be exempt. The value of the fines are fairly substantial for an initiative with so many grey areas. It's not really a question, more of a comment, but I tend to agree. Is there a clear letter that says if you were a director before October 2022, you need to do this? Simplified, it would be nice. Again, I don't really have a question there. Is there an area to provide the ABRS where we can petition them that ceased officer should not apply? If they become a director again in the future, then okay. Certainly, Deborah. Unfortunately, the legislation is the way that it is, and the only way you change legislation in Australia is by politicians passing it. So maybe don't email the ABRS, but to your local MP. Are you still able to lodge ASIC documents after 30th of November using CAS desktop? Yes, you are, Don. As a director appointed before the 30th of the 11th, 2021, but now had passed away in October 2022, would you still need to apply for an ID before 31? Okay. Anyone that's passed away does not need to apply. Very, very hard. I won't make a joke, but yeah. The fines and penalties won't be applied to someone who has unfortunately passed away. From the ATO, if a director has passed away, then they aren't required to hold a director ID. If a person has passed away, all bets are off, right? Full stop. There's no requirement for anyone that's passed away. How can we see a template of what is being sent to a client? My reason for asking is I'm sure if the client first name, surname will pre-fill actually will work, Peter, it will absolutely work. The best way for you to see this, obviously if you're going to settings, email settings, find the email template and you can view it. If you want to test it out, create a dummy company and put yourself as a director and send the email to yourself. Right, that would be the best way of testing it out. But certainly you can view it by looking at the template. How do I get a director ID for someone who is ceased / passed away? Again, anyone that has passed away, there is no requirement whatsoever. If the person has passed away, there's no requirement. They will not be fined. There's fine. Does that mean there is no exemption form? Is a person has I won't mention it, but if a person has an issue, look, Joe, I mean, that's much more of an issue for the ABRS to follow up on, and I would certainly go down that path. I genuinely don't have an answer. Andy's typing the answer to Jackie's question, so I'll move on. Can I get a listing of all the design directors reminder template? Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit lost on the question. There's so many going on.
Hello, everyone. If you've got any more questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A. We'll continue answering, and yeah, Warren will be connecting back again soon.
All right, can you hear me? I hope I'm back.
Yes, you're back. We can hear you.
Hey. All right, sorry guys, internet got me. All right, here we go. I'll keep going. Can I get a list of all resigned directors if my deactivated companies? Yes, we'll try to add them in. All right, Next one, can this Q&A also be available? Yeah, without the internet cutout, hopefully. So if a director was a director before October 21 but resigned this month, they still need to apply? Yes, they do. I think that's all the questions I could see, Andy. Are you able to provide a copy of this? Yes, you'll be able to get a copy of this webinar. And yeah, the Q&A will be made available post the session. I can't see any more questions than that, Andy. Oh, that's all I've got. So if there are no more questions, I'd like to say, first of all, sorry for the internet cutting out. But secondly, thank you for coming along to the session today. I hope that, that we were able to help you out, answer any questions that outstanding questions that you had around Director ID. Certainly, we've built some features in CAS 360 to really help you get through to your clients about the importance of Director ID. So thank you all for coming along, guys. I hope that, that the Director ID, the final countdown, the last month goes well for you all, and that you are all able to get your Director IDs sorted and look after your customers. But thank you all for coming along. I hope you've all had a fantastic session today, and have a great weekend ahead. Thank you very much. Goodbye.